Matthew stayed back. It wasn't worth risking getting caught. There was something wrong, and this was his only chance to figure it out. Instinctively, he felt compelled to uncover the truth. As he prepared to unravel this mystery, he quietly hurried toward an unoccupied table. When he realized what was really going on, he'd lose it. From where Matthew was sitting, he had a perfect view of his son and mother-in-law. He could tell something was wrong by the sad look in the little boy's eyes. Despite this, Matthew didn't approach him or his mother-in-law. Matthew saw red when a waiter brought their food. There was something amiss. Matthew wasn't concerned when Mason complained he was hungry for the first time. His assumption was that his son was going through a growth spurt. He considered this an issue that could be resolved with a quick trip to the refrigerator. There was something more going on here that the dad was unaware of. There was no reason for Matthew to believe that anything suspicious was going on. Grandmas feed kids the best, according to him. In fact, his son should have complained that he was too full. Matthew quickly forgot about the issue. As time went on, this became a daily occurrence. Initially, the little boy visited the kitchen unexplainably, since he rarely visited it unless he had to. Mason would wait for dinner in the kitchen every evening when Matthew got home from work. If there were leftovers in the fridge, he would delve fist deep into them, eager for something to eat. This made Matthew chuckle at first. It looked like his son hadn't eaten in days as he stuffed his face. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and click the notification bell for more amazing stories. He wolfed down all the leftovers from the previous day with a wide smile, including shredded turkey, cornbread, and cranberry sauce. Matthew became concerned when the cycle continued for weeks. Surely eating so much wasn't healthy for him. Before going to work, Matthew and Emma served the boys cereal in the mornings. To ensure their son would feel full throughout the day, they would also leave him a selection of fruits that were high in fiber. Their son was always given enough food to last him for hours, but his grandmother also had to feed him a large meal around lunchtime. Matthew realized as the days passed that his son seemed to be hungry all the time. He wondered if his mother-in-law followed this rule. That didn't seem to be the case. As the days turned into weeks, the little boy complained that he was hungry. Every evening, he raided the kitchen and cleared out any edible food he could find. Watching him silently, Matthew became concerned. Suddenly, he became concerned about his mother-in-law feeding his son. In the absence of Matthew and his wife, was Lillian giving the boy enough food? Having never been one to jump to conclusions, Matthew decided to take an objective approach to the situation. He asked Lillian about her son's eating habits one afternoon. Matthew asked the woman if she was feeding his son as instructed. She assured him that he was getting all the nutrients he needed. There was something wrong, though, as Matthew could tell. Matthew's worry increased. With the keenness of a hawk, he began to watch his son. Over the weekend, everything seemed fine to him. There would be a proper lunch and a decent amount of dinner for the boy. On the other hand, when he was left alone with his grandmother, he would be ravenous by dinner time. Matt and Emma's son continued to act in this way as time passed. Every evening, he would appear in the kitchen looking for food. When he was hungry, he would eat anything his parents put in front of him with the zeal of someone who hadn't eaten for days. Their little boy's health became more of a concern to Matthew and Emma. However, they had no idea how bad the situation actually was. As the weeks passed, the situation only worsened. As Matthew became increasingly concerned about his son's health, he decided to investigate the matter. He began tracking his mother-in-law's activities throughout the day. His suspicion was that she was lying about feeding the boy. His problem was proving it. In spite of his efforts, he couldn't find anything unusual about it. Lillian showed no hostility or resentment towards his son. Furthermore, he noted how caring she was towards the boy. His investigation seemed to have hit a wall. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, he decided to go to a diner with his mother-in-law. Originally from Jackson, Mississippi, Emma and Matthew Jones met on the job. The two weren't interested in each other at first. Neither saw the other as anything more than a cog in the grand machine, someone to work with for a few months or years before moving on to whatever life had in store for them. Their relationship changed after they bumped into each other at a dinner party hosted by a mutual friend. The first thing they discussed was their work and what they found interesting about their chosen careers. After that, their conversation went beyond the office as they discussed their likes and dislikes. Matthew was head over heels in love with Emma before he even realized it. The couple decided to get married 2 years later. Matthew couldn't explain how they came to be here. In those 2 years, he had the best years of his life, and he couldn't believe he still had decades more of the same to look forward to. In their early years as a newlywed couple, he and Emma concentrated solely on their careers. A local law firm offered Emma a position at one of its biggest firms. Matthew had just been promoted to department head. It couldn't have been better. It was their careers that ruled their lives for the longest time. Before trying to have children, they had already agreed to reach the peak of their careers. In theory, the idea sounded great. After such a long conversation, the two even shared a toast. They never imagined they would have children until something tragic happened. It was a terrible surprise to hear the news. During a peaceful Saturday afternoon at home, Emma's phone started ringing. On receiving it, she immediately froze. She had just been informed that her mother was in the hospital by the caller. Suddenly, her entire world crumbled. Her first reaction upon hearing the news was to rush to the old woman's side. Lillian, Emma's mother, had never been in the best of health. In addition to being overweight, she had a huge sweet tooth. Emma had attempted to discourage her from following her chosen diet, which usually consisted of fried foods and sugary desserts. Upon learning her mother had type 2 diabetes, Emma's heart sank. During this time, Emma had a chance to reflect on her family. There was a fear in her heart that something would happen to her mother. It had been years since her father died, a tragedy from which Emma and Lillian had never fully recovered. From Emma's side of the family, Lillian was all she had left. By her side, she cried that night, knowing that this simple truth needed to be changed. Lillian had always dreamed of becoming a grandmother. It had always been a topic of discussion, even before Emma met Matthew. "Don't make the same mistake I did," she warned. "Have kids early so that your house will always be filled with love. I want to have kids so I can watch them grow before I die." Emma sat beside Lillian as her words rang in her head. For the first time, Emma thought about becoming a mother. The next morning, she decided to talk to Matthew about having children. As soon as Matthew agreed, she was overjoyed. Lillian's condition improved as the weeks passed, but Matthew and Emma still tried to conceive. Following a few years of marriage, they were finally ready to start a family. Before they knew it, Lillian had been released from the hospital. Compared to when she was wheeled in, she appeared healthier. Emma was grateful, especially because her mom had fought her way back from death. As Emma held her hand, she shared some good news of her own. Their first child was on the way. They had no idea what lay ahead of them. The whole time Emma was pregnant, Lillian kept herself as healthy as possible. As a means of staying healthy, she cut out all sugar and carbs from her diet and walked around town frequently. As soon as she saw her symptoms disappear, she knew she was on the right track. The woman became healthier with every passing day as Emma watched. Her mom's accomplishments made her prouder than words could express. Only if she had known what the woman would do to her son in the future. As the months passed, Emma's pregnancy continued to go well. Meanwhile, Lillian had lost almost 50 pounds. As well as being energetic and lively, she was always full of joy. She had completely changed her diet, as well as her daily routine. Emma and Matthew were happy for her. They had no idea how her intense dieting would affect their child. It wasn't long before Matthew and Emma got the day they had been waiting for. After Emma's water broke, Matthew rushed her to the delivery room, anticipating the moment for months. Mason's birth marked the happiest day of the couple's lives. The love Matthew felt as he held the baby in his arms was unlike any he had ever experienced before. Matthew greeted Mason and gave him a gentle kiss on the head, as many dads do when their children are born. He gently lifted him up and called out his name, something that had long been on his mind. His promise that day was to protect his son at all costs. It took him a few years to realize that his son would be in a dangerous situation soon after. 6 years had passed, and before they realized little Mason was no longer so little. Matthew and Emma were delighted to see their boy growing into a happy and healthy boy. Over the past 6 years, Emma has been a stay-at-home mom. She had given her all to make Mason's early years the best they could be. Her desire to get back to work was now stronger than ever. Every time Emma had something on her mind, she talked to Matthew. When she told Matthew how much she missed being at work, he agreed that it was an excellent time for her to get back to work. Despite making a quick decision about Emma returning to the office, the two knew they had to resolve Mason's babysitter issue. When Lillian heard that her daughter and son-in-law were away at work, she offered to take care of the boy. The agreement seemed fine to the parents, but something was about to go wrong. It began immediately. Emma was overjoyed when she saw her son after her first day back at work. Just a minute later, Matthew stepped through the door and Mason complained of hunger for the first time. "Is there anything to eat, Mommy?" he asked with wide eyes and chapped lips, looking like he spent the entire day fighting on some sort of unknown front line. Emma and Matthew didn't give it much thought. The mom hurried to the fridge and made a sandwich for the boy. They prepared dinner as soon as Lillian left, but that night, something truly strange happened. As Matthew watched his son dig into his mashed potatoes and gravy, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had downed 3 chicken sandwiches before dinner, not 1 or 2. His plate was polished in record time, much to Emma's and Matthew's surprise. It wasn't even required that they beg the boy to eat his vegetables. Emma theorized that night that he might be hungry because he spent all day outside playing. The newfound appetite of her son didn't concern her or her husband. As they watched Mason consume nearly 2 plates of food the following evening, they were amazed. Initially, Emma and Matthew didn't take notice of the fact that he wasn't the biggest eater. But the same thing kept happening night after night. Mason would spend every evening in the kitchen, either scrounging for snacks or eagerly awaiting dinner. This made Matthew chuckle at first. Matthew loved to eat and would sometimes eat until he couldn't think anymore. It seemed that his son was finally following in the footsteps of his father. Mason stuffed his face like he hadn't eaten for days, as Matthew watched proudly. He was a growing boy after all. The boy ate as if he were competing in a food-eating contest every day. Matthew's fascination soon turned to worry, and then into raw dread as the cycle continued for weeks. The amount he ate must have been unhealthy for him, right? He looked up at Emma as she was tying her apron and getting ready to start dinner one evening, saying, "I'm starving." Matthew, who had been watching closely, was concerned by those words. His son's sudden change in appetite kept him awake at night as he lay in bed. Did Lillian cause it, or was he sick? Matthew tried to pinpoint the cause of the problem. He hated that all fingers pointed toward his mother-in-law. He wasn't sure, but the more he thought about it, the more suspicious he became of Lillian. Over the weekends, Mason seemed fine, but as soon as he was left with Lillian during the week, he would complain. It was becoming increasingly clear that what was happening here revolved around her. Did she have something to do with it? Wasn't she in charge of Mason's food whenever the parents were away? The following day, Matthew couldn't stop thinking about it. He wanted to know what was happening when he and Emma weren't home. Was Lillian not feeding the boy? He couldn't help the uneasy feeling that bubbled in his stomach. He wanted to bring it up with his wife, but didn't know how she would feel about it. He knew how close Emma and Lillian were to each other. They were the last of their line, with Mason acting as the sole guarantee that their lineage would continue. Such a dynamic between mother and daughter wasn't anything to scoff at. But could Matthew tell Emma that he suspected her mother of having something to do with this? Matthew spent his morning quiet in his office. He was motionless in his chair, thinking about the awful situation he had found himself in. His son was struggling, seemingly spending his day without any food. Matthew thought back to the day his son was born. It was the day he promised to protect him no matter what. Something fishy was at play, and the worried dad had to figure it out and help his son. He needed a sure plan that wouldn't jeopardize the relationships around him if he was wrong. He started plotting, trying to figure out the best way to bring Lillian's actions to light. But just then, his phone pinged, revealing Lillian's name. He had received a text from his mother-in-law. He rushed to open it, reading the words, "I'm taking Mason to the family pub downtown for lunch." His eyes widened as he got up from his seat. Although he had a good relationship with Lillian, she rarely texted him. She usually informed Emma of her whereabouts if she left the house with Mason. This was the perfect opportunity to see what was going on. He couldn't explain why Lillian had texted him instead of his wife, but he was glad nonetheless. As the hour was leaning toward mid-afternoon, Matthew jumped into his car without a second thought and floored the accelerator. He had to see what was going on. The drive downtown seemed to last a lifetime, even though the roads were clear and Matthew was driving as fast as road rules allowed. The sun was bright before him, the winds cool. But Matthew couldn't enjoy the ambiance. For the entire duration of his journey, he thought about his mother-in-law and his son. He wondered what he might see once he reached the restaurant. Eventually, after zipping through the nearly non-existent lunchtime traffic, Matthew stopped in front of the massive family pub. The diner's name shone before him, the sweet and savory aromas welcoming him as he pulled away from the road. Lillian's car was in the parking lot, but he was about to stumble across a terrible truth. Matthew, who hadn't had lunch yet, had to steel himself from the inviting smells and scene. He was here on a different agenda and needed to stay on course. He slowly walked into the restaurant, hesitant to show his face. If Lillian knew that he was there, spying on her, it would cause months' worth of trouble. "Hello, sir. Table for one?" a young waitress asked. Matthew knew he couldn't sit for food. There was a chance the waitress might walk him through the dining floor, where his son or mother-in-law might see him. No. I'm looking for an old lady and a child. It's my mother-in-law, but they can't know I'm here," he explained. The waitress had a suspicious look on her face as she walked him through the restaurant. Matthew was keen to stay hidden as he followed her to a secluded table. He silently thanked her for agreeing to his request, despite how odd it was. Matthew sat. He couldn't risk getting caught. Something wasn't right, and this was his opportunity to get to the bottom of it. To fully blend in, he ordered a small beef slider and fries. As the waitress hurried off, Matthew started scanning the restaurant. His table had a great view of the entire establishment. From where he was sitting, he had the perfect view of his son and mother-in-law. He couldn't help but notice the sadness in the little boy's eyes. Matthew wondered why he seemed so miserable. He watched from afar, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Lillian and Mason were waiting on their orders as they made small talk. Matthew watched Lillian closely. She seemed just as caring as when he and Emma were around. She got Mason to smile. Matthew wondered if he'd made a mistake coming out here. He'd never really had any issues with his mother-in-law. From his experience, she was a good person through and through. The waiter approaching their table with 2 small plates. That's when he saw red. The waitress shared a look with Mason before sliding his plate close to him. Her eyes gleamed with pity. Matthew watched with wide eyes as the waiter placed nothing but a side salad in front of Lillian and Mason. The little boy looked extremely disappointed as he stuck a fork into his plate, bringing a piece of cucumber up to his mouth. Matthew's molars ground against each other. Why on earth was his son eating such a small lunch? He needed protein and starch. He and his wife had chosen to trust Lillian, and yet here she was, feeding their son a small plate of salad. Why did she decide to take such a route with Mason? Matthew couldn't take it any longer. He shot up from his seat, barely able to contain his anger. The waitress was hurrying back with his food, but he couldn't care less. He approached Lillian and Mason's table unheard like a grizzly on the prowl. Mason noticed him first, his little face lighting up when he saw his father. Lillian was stunned to see her son-in-law. "Matthew, what are you doing here?" she questioned. Matthew could hardly contain his anger. "Is this his lunch?" he barked. He'd spent weeks wondering why his son was always hungry. "Is this what you have been feeding him?" he asked, and everyone in the restaurant turned to him. No wonder he has been starving. Lillian was in shock at his words. "Starving? What do you mean he's been starving?" Lillian asked. Her eyes bounced between her son-in-law and grandson. She looked like she had no idea Mason was always hungry. "I've just been feeding him healthy, low-calorie meals," she said, still stunned by Matthew's outburst. "The last thing we want is for him to end up sick like Grandma over here," she explained. Matthew's face softened when she said those words. He looked around, seeing that all eyes in the restaurant were trained on him. He knew then he'd tackled this situation wrongly, raising his voice at his mother-in-law. Suddenly, he felt terrible. Guilt and embarrassment flooded his veins, and he had to sit down, or he'd fall over. Matthew took a seat opposite his mother-in-law and explained the situation, stating that his son was far too young to be on a diet. Lillian had no idea that the boy had been starving. She was just trying to keep him healthy. Matthew told her about the many times Mason had wolfed down everything in the kitchen because he was starving. Lillian felt terrible as he explained this to her. She had no idea that what she was doing was affecting the boy negatively. Matthew accepted her apology and ordered himself and his son a decent meal while the old woman finished her salad. He told Lillian how glad he and Emma were that she was leading a healthy life. They were equally happy that she'd decided to help them with Mason. He also apologized for his outburst. It was all a misunderstanding, and at the end of the day, all was sorted out. Binding bonds through beautiful tales. Thank you for watching.